common obstacle that I see people run into when they're trying to get started with test-driven development in the context of a web application is they just don't know what the very first test is that they're supposed to write. If you're trying to follow like a textbook TDD approach where you don't write a single line of code before you've written a test first, what's the first test that you should write? How do you decide what's code and what's not code? Am I allowed to create a route without writing a test first? Am I allowed to create a migration without running a test first? These are the sorts of things that I've got hung up on in the past, and I see people getting hung up on still today. So I thought it would be useful to walk through an example of how I might get started with a brand new application implementing a new feature, and what sort of tests I would write to get the ball rolling. Okay, so imagine we're building a little Twitter clone, and we're going to do it with TDD. What are some of the features that this application needs to have, and how do we decide which one that we should start with? So I have a little list here of some things that we might need to be able to do. We might need people to create an account. People might need to be able to post tweets, maybe view another user's tweets, or follow another user, or view a list of tweets on my timeline. How do you pick which one of these is the most important one to get started with? Well, in Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests by Nat Price and Steve Freeman, they have a heuristic that they use for choosing which feature to start with, based on this idea of stringing up what they call a walking skeleton. So for them, their goal at the very beginning of an application is to try and get something strung up that's running that kind of represents the general setup of the system as early as possible. But they want to do it by picking the smallest possible feature they can that kind of cuts through most of the system, from the user interface through to the database, and then back to the user after they've performed some sort of action. So keeping that in mind, where would be a good place to start? How does create an account fit into that criteria? It's not a bad choice. The only reason I would say that I would avoid choosing create account as the first feature is that it doesn't really have anything to do with our application. We're trying to build a Twitter clone. This app should be about tweets and stuff related to that. I find it's very easy to pick features like create an account and build all that stuff first and kind of avoid the core kind of business value of your application by sort of dancing around these tangential features. So for me, I don't think that's a good candidate. How about posting a tweet? Posting a tweet seems at first like it might be a good option, but it kind of touches some things that I want to avoid if possible. I think there's things that we could do that would be smaller. So with posting a tweet, we need people to have an account so that they can be logged in, so that when they post a tweet, it gets associated with them. That seems a little bit complicated. It seems like it's touching too many things. Maybe we'll come back to it if that one ends up being the best option, but I'd like to look at some of the other ones. So viewing another user's tweets. So what does this involve? Well, you don't need to be logged in to view another user's tweets, so that's kind of useful. So we don't have to worry about having accounts or dealing with authentication or anything like that. And it's still related to the main concept of what the application is about, which is tweets. So it's providing some sort of business value if I can go to someone's page and see a list of their tweets. But it avoids all this authentication concerns and stuff like that. So for me, I think this is as good a place as any to get started. So why don't we start with that and see what happens? So coming back to that initial question of, can I create a route without writing a test, or can I create a migration without writing a test? I think that you can TDD the entire thing without writing any code like that up front. So I'd like to walk through how I would approach that. So let's create a test for this feature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder in my tests folder called features. I like to use an approach called outside-in TDD, or acceptance test-driven development. So we're not starting at the unit level here. I want to start with something that's user-facing, and we'll dive down into the unit level if necessary as we go, but I want to start with acceptance tests first. So we'll create a features directory, and in this features directory, we'll create a new file. I'll just save a copy of this example test case for now. And we'll call it view another user's tweets test. Okay. So looking at this test, what do we need to do to get started? Well, the first thing we got to think about, right, is what sort of preconditions do we need in the system for this to be able to work? So let's update this test name. So view another user's tweets test. And we'll test, we'll just call it test viewing another user's tweets for now. So how does the system need to be set up for this to work? We're going to need there to be a user and that user is going to need to have tweets, right? So how can we do that? There's a couple ways that we could do it, right? The first way would be, okay, well, another user needs to exist in the system, so we should go to the registration page, sign up that user, go to their profile, open up the tweet dialog, create some new tweets, do it all through the UI. But that's not going to get us where we want to get any faster, right? That's going to force us to go through this whole authentication thing that we were trying to avoid. So if there's another way to approach this, I think that would be the preferable approach in this case. There's another approach that we can use that's described in the RSpec book, which is a great resource for learning about getting an introduction to behavior-driven development and stuff in Rails. And they use an approach a lot of the time called direct model access, even in their acceptance tests. And what that means is directly creating the data that you need in the database instead of through the UI, even for a test that's mostly supposed to be run through the UI. So what does that look like in our case? Well, we need to have a user, right? Laravel provides some functionality out of the box called model factories for generating these sorts of things in your tests on the fly. So let's just walk through setting this stuff up and see what it looks like. So if we use the factory function to create a user, we'll just say user class, and we want to create a user. We might need to put some data in there, but let's not think about it too much for now. We're going to need a tweet, right? So hopefully they have at least one tweet. So we'll create a tweet, which, we don't have these things yet, but we're just writing out the setup steps that we wish would work. And then we'll walk through making this stuff work based on the test failures that we get. So we'll just make a tweet here rather than saving one. We might have some data that has to go in there as well. The user is going to have tweets, right? So we'll save this tweet to the user's tweets. So if we save their tweet, and now with any luck, if we visit maybe that person's profile page, which might be like / their username, so maybe they're John Doe, we should see the body of the tweet, right? That seems like a reasonable way to set up this test to me. So let's make sure that we give this person a username so all this stuff matches up. So we'll call them John Doe. We'll make a tweet that maybe has a body of my first tweet. And now when we go to John Doe's page, we should, with any luck, see my first tweet. And to me, this is a good enough place to get started from. So let's run this test quickly. See what happens. So our first error is unable to locate factory with name default user. So that means that there's no factory for this class. So let's pull up our factories file and see what we have. So out of the box, Laravel does give us a factory for the user, but the user is namespaced. So, it doesn't know that we're looking for the same user. So let's update this namespace reference and see what happens then. So I'm going to pull this out and I'm going to import this, and we'll do the same thing here, import that user, and run this test again and see what happens. So now we get an error, access denied for user Homestead at localhost. So it's trying to create a user in the Homestead database by default, and it doesn't have access to it because I'm just running this on my local machine. So let's tweak our database config so that the tests do have access to a database. So if we go to our config database file, you'll see here by default, it's choosing the connection based on an environment variable or defaulting to MySQL if there is no environment variable specified. What I'd like to use in my tests whenever I can is to use an in-memory SQLite database because it's nice and fast. So if we go to our PHP unit configuration, we can add some environment variables to the bottom here telling it to use SQLite instead of MySQL. So if we use the SQLite database connection, and then we want to use an in-memory database. So if we use, if for our DB database environment variable, we use a value of :memory:, which is some special syntax that SQLite knows about, this will use an in-memory SQLite database. We just need to make sure to make a little change here that tells our default connection to prefer the DB database environment variable over this database path if it's set. So we can say env DB database, otherwise use the database path. So if we run this again, hopefully we'll get a different error. Our error now is that there's no such table users. So that's useful. So that means if we go and look at our migrations, we do have a migration for the users table that Laravel gives us out of the box, but it's not running. So I'm going to use that test failure to tell me that we need to make sure we migrate our database in these tests. So Laravel ships with this database migrations trait. If we just use that, it'll automatically migrate our database at the beginning of the test. So if we run the test now, let's see what error we get next. Our next error is that table users has no column named username. And it's trying to insert a bunch of this other stuff here. So I'm going to take this as an opportunity to clean up that migration and make sure that it represents the data that we want our system to actually have. So if we go back to the migration here, you can see by default, Laravel is giving us an auto-incrementing ID, a name, an email, a password, and then a remember token and some timestamp related stuff. So I'm going to pull out the email and password. We'll leave the remember token because the way that Laravel's authentication system works, the default user is implementing some interfaces and stuff. Things get a little bit hairy if you remove too much of this boilerplate. So we'll remove what we can and tell this column to be the username column instead of the name column so it matches better with what we have in our test. And see what happens when we run it again. So running the test again, our error is table 1 users has no column named name. So what's happening here? Well, if we go look at our model factory, we can see that we're trying to insert a name, email, password, and remember token. So if we update this to be username, and we can use Faker's username generator for default values, we can get rid of the rest of this stuff. And with any luck, that should get us on to the next error in our test. So now we get an issue that it's unable to locate factory with the name tweet. So this is actually a really good sign. This means it successfully created and saved our user. And we've done that all with TDD so far. So that's really cool. So let's move on to fixing this error, unable to locate factory with name tweet. Okay. So let's create a tweet factory. So we'll call this tweet. And we said tweets were going to have bodies. So we'll give the tweet a body, and we'll just use a Faker's sentence generator here. And let's run the test again and see what we get. Class tweet not found. Okay, so let's generate a tweet model. So if we open the terminal here, we can just run php artisan make model tweet, and that should get us closer to where we need to be. So if we run this test again, still complaining that there's no tweet. Okay, so this is because the generated tweet is in the app namespace, and our model factory is not referencing that namespace. So let's import the tweet again here, just like we did with the user. And now if we run this with any luck, I'm expecting us to get an error that there's no model factory for this tweet class because we didn't import the namespace. But let's run the test anyways to make sure that our assumptions are correct. It's very helpful, in my opinion, to try and predict what your test failures are going to be because it gives you some confidence that you have a good understanding of how your system is working. So if we run this test again, we get an error unable to locate factory with the name tweet, just like we expected. So let's import that tweet class, run the tests again, and now we get an error call to undefined method illuminate database query builder tweets. So this is complaining because this tweets method that we're calling on the user is not defined anywhere. It's a little confusing when you look at the error because it's saying it doesn't exist on the query builder, but that's only because the way that Laravel's ORM is set up, any methods that don't exist on a model are automatically delegated to the query builder using the _call magic method. So it can be a little bit cryptic to decipher if you don't have a good idea of how that works, but this is pretty easy for us to get going with. So again, let's look at that error again quickly. Call the undefined method tweets. So let's go to our user class and create this tweets method. So if we go to the user, we'll scroll down to the bottom here, we'll add a tweets method and run the test again and see what happens. Call to a member function save on null. So tweets is returning null instead of returning a relationship that we can save the tweet into. So we can update that here by just saying return this has many tweets. And this should get us onto the next step. So running the test again, our next error is that there's no such table tweets. Okay, so we need to generate a migration for our tweets table now because we have no table. So going back to the terminal again, we can run php artisan make migration. We'll call it the create tweets table migration, and it'll create a tweets table. generate that. And now if we open up that migration, we can see that it's scaffolded out some stuff for us to create this table. So if we run the test again, what happens? Next error, table tweets has no column named body. Okay, so we're trying to pass in a body through our model factory here, but our table has no body column. So let's add a body column to the table. So it'll just be a string column called body. And if we run the test again, hopefully we're on to the next error. So what is our next error here? Table 1 tweets has no column named user ID. Okay, so we need a relationship back to the user because tweets belong to users and users have many tweets. So we need to make sure that we add this foreign key reference. So if we go back to the migration, we can say table integer, and it's user ID we want to call it, and it should be unsigned because it's a foreign key. If we run the test again, hopefully we get a different error. So what is this messy one? So these sloppy ones usually mean something to do with the routes. So it's saying a request to our base URL / John Doe failed, received status code 404. So this is what's going to cause us to drive out our routing now, because our test is trying to hit a page that doesn't exist. So if we open our routes file, we can add a new route. I'm just going to delete everything here and we'll just start fresh. So we want a route. It's going to be a GET request, and it's going to go to someone's username, right? And now we could just create a closure here and start working within the closure, but I like to use a strategy that's referred to in the Goose book as programming by wishful thinking, where what we actually want to do in order to help us get to where we want to go is write the code that we wish we had, not necessarily the quickest, dirtiest code that's going to solve our problem. So I don't really want to work with an inline closure in the routes file. I would rather have a controller. So I'm just going to write the code I wish I had as if it existed and see where the tests take us. So maybe this would go call the show method on the user's controller. If we run this test again, hopefully we get a different error now. And now our next error is that it received a 500 because the user's controller does not exist. Okay, so now our test is telling us that it's okay to generate a user controller. So we'll go back to the terminal and we can generate that controller. So if we run php artisan make controller users controller, that should give us what we need here. So if we go and check that out, we should now have a users controller in our controllers folder. Great. If we run the tests again, we should get a different error hopefully now. So now it's complaining that the method show does not exist on the user's controller. Okay, so let's create a show method and see where that gets us. If we run the test again, we get an error that it failed asserting that empty string matches PCRE pattern my first tweet. So what it's saying is that whatever the controller returned, which was an empty string in this case, didn't contain the text that we were looking for. So it didn't contain this my first tweet text that we're expecting to see. So again, we could fake this by just returning that string directly, but I want to use this programming by wishful thinking strategy where instead we're going to identify what we wish we had and work towards getting that to work using the tests for feedback. So the reason that I don't see this working is because this isn't returning a view that's supposed to show that person's tweets, right? So if we just get started by just returning the view that should show that person's timeline, we can use that to drive out the next step. So let's return a view called users.show. I like my view names to match up with my controller action names. And if we run the test again, hopefully we'll get a different error. So what do we get? It's complaining that there is no users.show view. So let's create the users.show view and work from there. So if we go to our views folder, I'll create a new folder called users, and in that folder I'll create a new file called show.blade.php, and we'll run the tests again. And now it's complaining that it couldn't find that text in the empty string again, but this time it's because the view is empty, not because we weren't returning a view at all, right? So what do we need to do here? Again, we could slime the test here, or we could write the code that we wish we had that we wish would work. So maybe we want to show the tweets in just like an unordered list or something for now. So let's just write the code we wish we had. So why isn't it showing the tweets? Well, we haven't written the code to show the tweets. So let's kind of work on that. So let's just loop over the user's tweets. We're going to assume that we have a user to work with here. And inside that loop, we'll generate some list items that maybe just render the tweet body. And now if we run these tests again, we should, with any luck, get a different, more useful error. So now it's complaining that there's a syntax error, unexpected tweet. Oh, I missed a word here for each user tweets as tweet. Run the tests again. Undefined variable user in our compiled view here. Okay, so now it's complaining because we're not passing a user in from the controller. So let's just pass in the user as if we had one and let that drive out the rest of our implementation. So if we run this again, we should get an error now, hopefully, that the user variable is undefined in the controller rather than in the view. So we do in fact get an undefined variable user in the user's controller. So why is our user undefined here? Well, we're not getting the user that we need to have. So we got to think now. Again, we could use the slime tactic of just kind of writing the implementation that we need to get that user, or we could continue to think about the code we wish we had and see where that takes us. So we know we need to look up this user by their username, right? So one thing that you could do, right, is you could just say user equals user where username is username, and just take the first matching one and make sure that we're accepting that username parameter here. And this would work, right? But this isn't the code that we wish we had, and this isn't going to help us achieve the design that we want if we're always working this way instead of trying to work in a little bit more of an optimistic workflow. So the thing that I would do here instead is that I would expect that a method exists for finding a user by username and let that take us to the next level. So instead of this implementation, I would prefer something like find by username, and then I would run this and see what the error is. We know that method doesn't exist, but we want to program by wishful thinking, expecting that the code that we want to have already exists, and let the tests tell us what doesn't exist. So if we run the tests again, we get an error that the user class is not found because we haven't updated the namespace reference here. So let's import our user, run the test again, and what is our error this time? So now we're getting an error called the undefined method find by username. Great. So we need to go and implement this method. Now, we could just go straight into the user class and implement this right away, or we could use this as an opportunity to finally dive down to working at a more unit level and write some more tests. This is the strategy that I usually take. I usually let my acceptance tests drive out things like routing, controllers, migrations, stuff like that. And then I try to write as little code in the controller as possible by creating methods like this and use these failing tests as opportunities to write new tests to drive out this functionality at a lower, slightly more isolated level. So instead of just going straight to the user class and implementing this exactly as is, what I'd like to do is create a brand new test for this functionality and get that green and then bubble back up to the acceptance test and see what we have to do to keep working. So I'm going to create a new folder in my tests directory called unit. My definition of unit test is a little loose probably compared to a lot of people. I'm totally fine to write eloquent model tests that hit the database and call those unit tests. If you disagree with that, you can call the folder whatever you like, but this kind of features and unit separation has worked pretty well for me in the past, and that's what I like to use going forward. So in this unit folder, we're going to create a new test called user test that's going to test this user class. And I'm just going to copy this in as a starting point and basically clean it all out just so we have access to some of these traits and stuff, which are kind of helpful to be able to pull in. So this is going to be our user test. And we want to be able to test a user can be found by username. So how is this going to work? Well, let's assume that we have a user in the database. So this time maybe we'll create Jane Doe. So we'll say factory user class create, and then username is going to be Jane Doe. And then we want to try and retrieve that user back from the database by their username and make sure that we get the same user. So what would that look like? So we'll call this created user, and then we'll say found user equals user find by username Jane Doe. And then we'll write an assertion, maybe a couple assertions. So let's check that the created user ID is the same as the found user ID. And let's check that their names are the same. That seems like a reasonable place to start. So if we run this, I'm expecting our first error is going to be something related to this user namespace or not being able to find the factory. So let's try that out. unable to locate factory for the user class. So we'll import the user, run it again. I'm expecting this to be about us not setting up our database migrations. So we check the error, no such table users, great. So let's use database migrations again to make sure that our tables get migrated. Run the tests, call the undefined method find by username. Okay, so now we can pull up the user class and start implementing this method. So let's create a find by username method. Takes a username and it's a static method. And let's just run this test without doing any implementation yet and see what that tells us. Trying to get property of non-object because of the fact that find by username is not returning anything. So let's just return that implementation we talked about before. We'll just do like self where username is the same as the username, and we'll just return the first one. And with any luck, this test should pass now. And it does. And now if we bubble back up to our acceptance test and run this one passes as well. So now we've done this entire outside-in TDD loop where we wrote the acceptance test. It drove us to create routes, migrations, models, relationships. It allowed us to dive down to the unit level to implement a function that we decided we wanted to have based on this programming by wishful thinking attitude. And we've got all this stuff passing and all this code written and everything working without ever writing a single line of code before writing a test and without ever even having to open the browser. So I hope this has been a good introduction to the sort of workflow that you can use to get the ball rolling with TDD in your Laravel applications. If you have any comments or questions, email me or comment on the video. I'd love to hear them. And I hope I can share some more testing tips with you guys in the future. Thanks.